Now, if you think about how many muscles you've got to train across your body, you've got calves, quads, hamstrings, glutes, lats, pecs, upper back, delts, biceps, triceps. 9? I think that was 9. Just lost count. Hello and welcome back to the Smart Strength Training podcast. My name is Andy Vincent and this is podcast episode 19. And as always, I'm going to talk about a popular topic and give you as much nuance and insight as possible to help you understand it better. And today I'm talking about bulking and cutting cycles, or more the question, should you consider doing a bulking and cutting cycle? I find this term, bulking and cutting, just quite interesting because you go back sort of 10 years ago and really only professional bodybuilders, physique athletes would be talking about this. But now I have friends these days that say, oh yeah, a friend of my work, he's doing a bulk. Such is the power of social media. So bulking and cutting isn't new. I believe it's probably been around for even longer than I've been in the industry. It's been a staple for physique athletes and bodybuilders for decades. So let's explore what they are and whether or not you should consider doing them. But first up, let's make sure you understand what this terminology really means. So bulking is a period of training and dieting where the aim is to add as much muscle mass as possible by doing sort of hypertrophy blocks, so bodybuilding style blocks, and eating, importantly, at a caloric surplus. So eating more energy than your body requires to make sure you've got enough energy there for recovery. And then a cut then follows a bulk. So a cut is effectively a diet phase where you drop your calories down into a deficit. And commonly you would start on higher calories at the beginning of a cut and you would reduce those calories down as you got closer to your sort of target weight to make sure you continue to be in a deficit. And we'll discuss this in a bit more detail in a second. So why would you consider doing that sort of cycle? So building muscle is slow. At first, when you start lifting weights, you probably notice you built a bit of muscle, you notice that quite quickly, but then gains start to slow down, certainly slower gains than people probably had hoped. And a big part of this is, well, there's lots of reasons to this, but building muscle is actually quite an energy costly activity. And most people's diet and lifestyle probably aren't conducive to creating an environment that is optimal for building muscle. Often people sort of yo-yo a little bit. So some days they're eating nothing and just propping themselves up on Red Bull and croissants, for example, and then overindulging at the weekends. And like I said, we want to try and create this optimal environment, and that's sort of like feast famine. That's not necessarily going to do that. So purposely moving into periods where your calories are elevated to support muscle growth and your training is outlined accordingly is a great way to sort of mentally focus, and it gives you this opportunity to make sure that you leave no gains on the table as far as maximizing your muscle building potential. It's also great, of course, to have plenty of energy to train. So your energy for workout should be high, so your performance should be high. But of course, there is expected during a bulk that there will be some additional body fat added because the energy is elevated to aid recovery and to maximize recovery. So then let's discuss the issues with bulking, because that will be the major issue. That there is that expectation that people will gain some body fat, and that can make people freak out. And they instantly go back into a cut. So if you hear that and you're like, God, I hate the idea of gaining any fat at all, then straight away I'd say probably it's not for you. Continue to listen, because I think it's still worthwhile understanding the sort of principles around them. Because the reality is you don't necessarily need a really big surplus in energy. So how much of a surplus are we talking about? Actually, before I go into this, let's make sure we understand this terminology as well. So we have 3 energetic states that we can talk about. We have energy balance, which is effectively staying weight stable. That will be your maintenance calorie intake. You can then be in negative energy balance, which is going to be in a caloric deficit. So you're under eating in energy effectively. And you can be in a positive energy balance or a surplus of calories, and therefore you be gaining weight. And I think when people hear the word bulk, they have this sort of vision of some guy chowing down tons of pasta and pizza just to eat as many calories as possible. But I think it's really important to point out that the cycle is this bulk cut. So you have to remember that the more fat that you gain, the longer you need to be in a cut. So it's important to state that you probably don't want to gain a ton of fat mass during a bulk, because when you're dieting, and I've touched this a few times in a podcast, it's important to point out that when you're dieting and therefore eating a caloric deficit, you will be very likely losing some muscle mass at the same time. So you want to mitigate that to the best of your ability. Now, I think it's sensible, before you even consider this process, that you should be weight stable at least for 4+ weeks. So you understand that your current nutritional trends are keeping you at energy maintenance and therefore energy balance. And that so when you calculate your calories, this sort of thing, that you've got half a chance of those calories being correct at that moment in time. So let's now discuss where or how many calories we should be eating, how much of a surplus should we be in. So a really good research paper actually looked at this last year, 2023, and it tracked rates of muscle mass gained during 3 different energy intakes. One was energy maintenance, so matching the energy to make sure they were at energy balance. One was a 5% surplus, so 5% over their energy requirements, and the other was a 15% surplus, so a significant increase in their calories. So changes in muscle thickness were relatively consistent across all groups, indicating that large surplus wasn't really necessary for muscle growth. And both the maintenance and the moderate surplus, so 5% surplus, they experienced pretty similar hypertrophy across that particular research. Strength gains, however, the group on the 5% surplus increased the greatest strength gains compared to the energy maintenance and the 15% surplus group. Small caloric surplus of around 5% seems to be the most effective and efficient for building muscle and increasing strength. So I think it's important to state that your choices really are to eat at energy maintenance, or to eat at a slight surplus of around 5%. If you go up as high as 15%, you're not really getting anything beneficial, but you are going to gain extra fat at that level. So now you've established roughly what your energy intake should be. Now we probably need to have a think about what is the expected rate of muscle gain throughout this process, because you want to know how long you're going to need to be in a quote unquote bulk for. So rates of muscle gain, let's discuss. So for a beginner, in the first 0 to 1 years of training, for men, you could expect to gain between 1 to 1.5% of your total body weight per month. For women, it's about 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per month. I would suggest that most people, when they come into this bulk cut cycle, they're probably not going to be complete rookies. That's unlikely that someone that's a complete beginner is going to be thinking about this kind of thing or even have heard of it. So you're more than likely, if you're listening to this, could be an intermediate or an advanced. So for intermediates, between the first 1 to 3 years of training, that drops down quite significantly. So now for men, it moves down from 1 to 1.5 to 0.5 to 1%. So for men, 0.5 to 1% of body weight increases per month. And for women, it drops from 0.25 to 0.5% of body weight per month. And then let's be really honest, I think most people will probably be listening to this, are probably lifting weights for 3+ years. So you're falling a little bit more into that advanced, in the sense that your body has had all the easy adaptations because you've been putting force through the muscles. Therefore, the large increase in stimulus is just not that easy to place upon the system, which is always a challenge for those that have been engaging in physical or in resistance training for a while. So now it drops even more. So for men, it goes down to 0.25 to 0.5% of body weight per month, and for women down to 0.1 to 0.25% of body weight per month. So I think it's really important to highlight, of course, this is a range. To hit that top range, in my experience, you've got to have a lot of things aligned. It is unlikely that people are going to be able to do that because there's a lot of things you have to have kind of ticked off to hit that top end. So we recognize that rates of muscle gain are slow. But you go back to the start of this sort of sentence or so, we discussed, like, let's set that caloric expectation. So maybe maintenance or 5%. Have a think about, with what I just stated, how long it's going to take you to build that muscle mass that you're looking for. And as I mentioned, bad news, outside of being a complete newbie, it's unrealistic to expect a significant amount of muscle gain. So that being said, I do think in that sense, it is smart that unless you're a complete newbie, that you do get a little bit more specific, because one of the other things that's quite important to state is it's probably unrealistic to expect to gain lean mass across your entire body evenly throughout a sort of training bout. I think it makes a logical sense because most of us have time pressure. Maybe we can train 3-4 times per week. So if you're training 4 times per week, let's say 8 sessions per workout, that gives you 32 exercises in total. Let's say you do 3 sets of each of those exercises. That gives you a working total of 96 sets to divide across your training plan. Now, if you think about how many muscles you've got to train across your body, you've got calves, quads, hamstrings, glutes, lats, pecs, upper back, delts, biceps, triceps. 9? I think that's 9. Just lost count. So depending on your experience, you might need somewhere between 12 to 16 total sets to sort of maximize your hypertrophic training adaptations. So you might choose to put more of that volume, let's say on hamstrings and glutes, and some extra work on biceps and triceps. So that would mean that in your workout, you might have to choose to just 2 chest exercises, 2 back exercises, and maybe 1 calf exercise. And you'd need to do that to allocate the extra volume on hamstring, glutes, and arms. Because you wouldn't expect to see a huge amount of mass then on chest and hamstrings, on chest, but the hamstrings and glutes would be the areas that would develop a little bit quicker. I think this is a smart thing just to recognize that when you come to building your programs, I think it is smart to be a little bit regionally specific with what you do so you can really emphasize certain body parts. Then if you're doing, say, a 16-week block working on that glutes, hamstrings, and arms, at the end of 16 weeks, you might move that then to other muscle groups. So you can get a little bit more precise with where you're trying to build this muscle mass. Next up is we've got to think about tracking your progress, because this is where it can get a bit tricky. Body weight is not a measure of body composition, so that can be an issue. If you've got access to bioimpedance, that's great, but that's not overly accurate. Circumferences are good. That will give you some data. Photos, they can be good, but they can be a bit triggering. But I think it's good to have multiple measures on those sorts of things. But it also is a good reminder that tracking your progress in the gym is key, and progressive overload, so progressing what you do, is key. Now, I would suggest to track what you do every 2 to 4 weeks across your bulk, so you can keep in mind that what you want to make sure you're not doing is not gaining too much fat during this increase in calories. So if you're trying to quote unquote lean bulk, then the ratio that you're looking for is around a 3 to 1 increase in muscle mass compared to fat mass. So 3 times as much muscle as fat. And then like a moderate bulk would be something around like a 2 to 1 ratio. But anything close to a 1 to 1 ratio would not be recommended. I think it's important to recognize it's quite hard to measure that perfectly, because it's very hard to have the sort of sensitivity and accuracy in the kind of devices that you and I would have available to us. But I do think it's worthwhile to state that that's why every sort of 2 weeks doing some measurement, and then you can get a feel for what you think is going on. But I really urge people that do this, do not fall into the trap of, if you feel like you've gained a bit too much fat mass, that you just instantly go into a cut. I really suggest you stick to what you're doing. And then what I would probably state to do is at the end of your block. So yes, if you feel like you're gaining too much fat mass, by all means bring the calories down, but don't go into a diet. Just bring them down. So maybe you were at 15% surplus and you bring them down to 5 or to maintenance. But stick it through to its end. Maybe at the end of your training block, that might take you like 12 to 16 weeks. And therefore you could do a cut at the end of that before going back into the next block of training where you're in that bulk. That kind of transitions nicely into talking about cutting, which you probably have gathered what you need to know for this one. But At the end of a bulking phase, you would then move into a cut. So let's say you would do a bulking phase for 30 weeks and you added across that all the muscle mass you wanted. So you've added 7 kilos of lean muscle mass and 3 kilos of fat mass. I would call that a hugely successful bulk. But now, of course, you are 10 kilos heavier. And of course, a heavier framed human being requires more energy at rest. So you can start your cut actually at a higher caloric intake than you would have done if you were cutting at the very, very start of that bulk. But again, I think it can be smart to spend a bit of time making sure your weight's stable before you start going into a cut. So at the end of a bulk, I would always try and get people to spend at least 4 weeks staying at energy maintenance, stabilizing that body weight before going into a deficit. So let's go back to the numbers that I stated. So you gained 3 kilos of fat mass. So if we based on a rate of weight loss at 0.5 kilos per week, that would mean you're looking to do a 6-week cut. But maybe actually you wanted to cut a bit more body fat than that, so you're actually leaner than you were at the start of your bulk. So you might have chosen to lose 5 kilos of body fat. So that's going to be somewhere around 10 to 12 weeks of dieting. 5 kilos of fat mass should be simple enough to shift in one hit without taking a break. But if you had a more robust weight loss or fat loss goal, then you might need to consider a diet break as you do that. But again, it's another really good reminder to think about. You do not want to gain too much fat mass during a bulk because then it makes your cut even longer. So based on what I just said, that takes you to a 42-week process to gain 7 kilos of muscle mass based on 30 weeks of bulking and then around 12 weeks of dieting. So when you hear that, what are your thoughts? What are you thinking? Does that sound like the sort of thing that you want to do? It's a nice blueprint for some people to work off over the coming months. It creates real emphasis on what you're doing. But a lot of people might hear that and think, oh, that's a lot of effort for 7 kilos of muscle mass. I could just stick my calories at maintenance, try not to gain any fat mass, and just see how I go. And that is, of course, the other option. But it's nice to know that you have these options around it. So I'm now going to discuss a bit of personal insight. I think it's really important. Personal trainers love to do this. We love to talk about what we did and how that worked. So I'm mindful this is single person anecdote. This is me and what happened in my life. So it doesn't mean an awful lot for you, but it's just an example. When I first started working out, I was around 80 kilos. And to be honest, back in 2001, I had no clue what I was doing. So I was young, I was enthusiastic, and I gained around sort of like 5 to 7 kilos of muscle mass without any real sort of like intention to do so. Oh, the joys of being young. At around 89 kilos, I did my first ever bulk. And that took me up to 97 kilos in just over a year. It wasn't great, to be honest. I had a lot of GI tract distress at the time. And I remember at the end of that process, I just didn't really enjoy the way I looked. And I did a big cut and I cut back down to 93 kilos. And then I decided that I needed help. I'd seen dietitians as well at the time because of the GI tract distress that it caused. So I actually then worked with what is now a good friend of mine and a mentor, Mikey Smith, who was a PT I worked with for about 18 months with my program. And I learned a lot through that period. And he took me up to 100 kilos on a bulk, and then we cut back down to 97 kilos. And for years, I was really happy, and I never really wanted to do it again. And then I left London, and I had no real fancy scales or ways of tracking this kind of stuff. COVID hit, and I was one of those people that sort of like, I had kit at home so I could train at home with resistance. I had like barbells and things at home. So I just trained, locked my diet in, was really consistent. I ate around maintenance. I wasn't tracking anything, but I wasn't really gaining any fat mass. I was just training and enjoying it. I also, quite importantly, switched my emphasis to lower body, something I'd never done. I'd always been very, very upper body focused up to that point. So this was like mid-30s for me. And then after 3 years, when I actually came back to the UK, I jumped on a friend's scales and I was 107 kilos. And then I did a body fat test not long after. And my body fat was just slightly higher than it was when I'd left London in the first place. So across 23 years of my working out, I've done 2 very focused points of bulking and cutting. And then I've done one period of just longer eating at maintenance to gain that muscle mass. And like I said, so across that period, I gained 27 kilos of muscle. And I think when you talk to people who have gained muscle and just look at the research in this, that will generally support that kind of idea. You will probably gain slightly quicker rates of muscle mass if you do the intentional focus in surplus. Or you can just do more around the sort of maintenance. I don't really think for the average person that it is a black and white, night and day, you have to do this version, because there are obviously issues for both. If you don't like the idea of gaining fat mass and then going into a diet phase, then maybe eating at maintenance is better. If you really like the focus point of like intentional work, and I really get that from my clients that I do this with, they like to really dial things in and really focus. What I would say is the problem with being at maintenance is it can feel a bit wishy-washy. You're sort of in the middle, you're not really focused on what you're doing, and people sort of lose that impetus of training. And finally, my final note, and again, this is just my own personal belief, this isn't necessarily 100% professional insight in that sense. When I see this discussed, it's online specifically. I see it in sort of late 20s, early 30s. And I think about when I was that age, when I was doing this, I loved this sort of thing. I had the time, I didn't have a business. I look back at that period with really fond memories, and it was great. But I had the lifestyle to support it. I'm now 44. I don't really have the appetite to do that ever again. I guess I am fortunate enough now that I kind of have done the process early on and probably don't need to do it again at my current body weight. But I do think it's important that you have to sort of audit your life and think, do you have the capacity to go into something like this based on the fact that it might take you over a year, in fairness, to complete it. But that being said, for some people that creates so much emphasis on what they're doing or impetus on what they're doing that it is it's the best way for them. So it is very much down to the individual. So hopefully that gave you some good insight into this bulking cutting cycle. It is something that I help clients with in my practice online, in my online coaching. So if you'd like help with online training, working through a bulking phase and a cutting phase, then get in touch with me for one-on-one online training.